Good afternoon. I'm Barbara Gross, Dean of the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study, and it is a great pleasure to welcome you to this year's Phelps Lecture at the Radcliffe Institute. This lecture is one facet of our commitment to integrating the arts and scholarship. Before we begin, a few bits of logistical information. There are exits at the front and back of the room. We will have a question and answer period after the lecture. There will be a microphone in the middle aisle, and if you would please line up at that microphone to ask your question, we'd appreciate it. Finally, there will be a reception downstairs, and you're all welcome to join us and join our speaker there at the reception. Julia Phelps, for whom this lecture is named, had 3 Radcliffe degrees, including a PhD in fine arts. She greatly enriched the Radcliffe Seminars program for 3 decades through a variety of art history courses and in many study tours to Europe. In 1984, Phelps received the Radcliffe College Presidential Commendation for distinguished teaching. She was renowned for the breadth of her knowledge, her enthusiasm for and interest in her students, her passion for lifelong learning, and her commitment to Radcliffe. The Phelps Lecture was established by family, friends, and colleagues of Julia Phelps in memory of her dedication to teaching and the arts. We are grateful to them for providing us an opportunity to celebrate the arts through lectures from pioneering leaders like today's distinguished theater director, whose recent work, Black Watch, was hailed by the Washington Post as theater's most ingenious portrait to date of the war in Iraq and of modern warfare in general. By enabling us to bring such celebrated speakers to the Radcliffe Institute and greater Harvard community, the Phelps Lecture enriches intellectual lives while providing an opportunity to remember and honor Julia Phelps. Today's speaker will be introduced by someone intimately familiar with the Institute's commitment to bringing artists and scholars together and to facilitating creative encounters that catalyze new and original research. Beth Lyman, Assistant Professor of English in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, was an Institute Fellow last year. Her work on the history of notation and dramatic stage directions exemplifies the innovative scholarship the Institute is so pleased to support. Beth.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Barbara. It is wonderful to be back at Radcliffe, where I spent last year one of the most productive and happy years of my professional life, and which, through the intellectual and personal friendships that developed, continue to enrich it. Today, it's my pleasure to introduce the director, John Tiffany. It's no exaggeration to say that John Tiffany has fast become among the most exciting theater directors in the English-speaking world. As founding associate director of the National Theatre of Scotland, he's already a moving forces in something extraordinary. The National Theatre of Scotland, founded in 2006 and based in Glasgow, is a model in the contemporary theatre world, almost, at least among major theatre companies, without precedent or peer. It has a daring structure and a performance model. The company owns no theaters, and so it has no comfortable and familiar facilities into which to retreat or expensive ones to maintain. Artists are instead artistic travelers who pour out their resources into continually new spaces, and by necessity, imaginatively use the specificity or the flexibility of those spaces in the design of their productions. A very interesting concept. In his productions at the National Theatre and elsewhere, John Tiffany, in his own words, uses all the possibilities of theatre to tell a story. His productions do, in other words, what everyone in the theatre claims to do and wants to do, but few are really good at doing, which is distributing the story among coordinated theatrical elements so that a sound, like a bagpipe, or a gesture, like sign language, or a particular confluence of light, or an interaction, a moment, a break between scenes, some kind of community of breathing human bodies, individual, general, collective yet separate, work on our senses simultaneously to create an experience that none can convey in isolation. And each response shared with those nearby in the contagion of emotional response that is live theater is created by these multiple languages that he speaks of. Of the many shows John Tiffany has directed, he's best known for the international sensation, I think it's fair to call it that, of Black Watch. Black Watch was written by David Burke with movement by Stephen Hoggett and music by David Anderson. It's drawn from interviews with former members of a Scottish Army regiment stationed in Iraq, a regiment with roots leading back centuries that was dissolved or perhaps absorbed in the wake of the Iraqi deployment. It shows what it means to be part of the war on terror and what it means to make that journey home again, as one critic describes it. Black Watch and John have won more than 20 awards, just a tremendously honored show, including 4 Laurence Olivier Awards, including Best Director for John Tiffany and the New York Drama Circle's Best Foreign Play. It's difficult to describe in words alone a theatrical experience in words on which words only play a part. And critics and other audience members can be seen stumbling over one another, trying to explain what they experienced, why it had such a great impact, that full sensory engagement that stirs the intellect and the empathy and the emotion, how it differed from other productions that make similar claims. But something lies within and behind their words, the words of critics, I think, in which we can begin to grasp, almost through repetition and accretion of words, some sense of what that is. So I wanted to give you a few excerpts from literally hundreds of reviews of Black Watch, so that you can listen to the language of these critics struggling to convey what it was that they felt. It was electrifying. Sporadically scatters into sprinting, into panic-stricken chaos. I'm making a collage of about a dozen reviews. A blistering piece of physical theater, comical, visceral, lyrical, a blast of fresh air, energy, conviction, absolutely astonishing. It was filthy, furious, comically hyper-aggressive, startling, noisy, upsetting, violent, thrilling, a pulsating epic, spectacular, flawless. By the end, it is hard to believe that these coiled and dangerous young men are actors at all. And again, a whirlwind, astonishing. The world must see this play. Compelling, magnificent, arrives like a blazing redeemer with blazing vitality. A thrilling combination of complex political argument, hard-edged naturalism, barrack room banter, deep regimental history, spectacular visual effects, and superb music and movement. Powerful, urgent, perfectly realized, storming, heart-stopping, terrible in its tenderness, deeply humane, robustly inventive, electrifyingly imaginative, a glorious piece of theater, raw, truthful, uncomfortable, political, funny, moving, gracious, and glorious. And one more. Superlatives, one critic says, are no exaggeration. This is a stunning show, astonishing. Black Watch has been described as both documentary and lament, accusation, and elegy, and as a hymn to soldiers, an indictment of the foolishment that makes their jobs necessary. Already, it has become, and being called, a cultural landmark of our time. It is the kind of theater theaters dream of producing, and the kind of theater we dream of having the privilege to watch. The political and emotional force of Black Watch have given a special place in contemporary culture, but Black Watch is only one of many stunning and moving and inventive productions that John Tiffany has directed. Barrie's Peter Pan, Lorca's The House of Bernard Alba, Euripides' Bacchae, and on, each with its own insights, its own sharp perspective, its unique complex of visual images, and surprising scenic and sonic effects, each with its own glowing and articulately insufficient reviews. If artists are burnished by constant use, then John Tiffany, I think, gleams. Creativity and activity, the realization of ideas, often come in bursts and are fueled by periods of reflection, in which those ideas to be realized are formed. It's one of the unusual virtues of this institute, of the Radcliffe Institute, that it invites not only scholars into its community, but also artists, theater, film, visual arts, music, dance, to bring their gifts in and to share their insights and have a space in which to pause for a moment, for the difficult work of thought that lies behind initiating new projects and moving in fresh directions. John Tiffany's project at the Radcliffe Institute is one about which we should all be excited. Wittily entitled, "I Speak, Therefore I Am," it combines the quotidian with the esoteric, the performative, the cognitive, and even the unconscious. It focuses on something with which we're all intimately familiar, the human voice, to explore the mysteries and the magic and the strategies by which we use language and sound to communicate, manipulate, and obfuscate. There's been a great deal of attention paid in recent years to the subtlety with which we express and interpret facial cues in everyday life and in performance. This project promises to take us into new territory that is similarly both familiar and strange. Today, the title of John Tiffany's talk is, "Can We Keep Up? Theater's Incredible Ability to Evolve." I cannot imagine a person better suited to ask this question or to answer it. So now will you please join me in welcoming the Julia S. Phelps Annual Lecturer in Art and Humanities, John Tiffany.
Wow, thank you. Can I take you on tour with me, please? That was amazing. And actually, I wrote all those reviews. I'd just like to start by saying thank you very much to Dean Gross for asking me to give this lecture. I've been asking around and reading about Julia S. Phelps over the last couple of weeks, and she was clearly an amazing woman, so I really understand what an honor this is. Thank you. And I'd also just like to thank the Radcliffe Institute generally, to Judy and to Melissa, Marlon, and Sharon, just for this opportunity this year. When I first came in September, I remember speaking to some of you and saying what I'm really looking forward to whilst I'm here is the chance to think, because since I've been working as a theatre director for the past 15 years, the thing that I haven't had a chance to do is think. But what I didn't realise it would do was allow me to think about the past 15 years, which has been incredible. And I know I sounded a bit like Donald Rumsfeld, but who knows that I thought that I would think that I think now. And what I'm going to talk today about is those past 15 years and the work that I've done, particularly in the last 5 years with the National Theatre of Scotland, but also the work that I'm doing here. So, as you can see, it's called "Can We Keep Up? Theatre's Incredible Ability to Evolve." And you see how I've conceded to the American spelling of theatre. From its very beginnings, theatre has shown an incredible ability to evolve. The ancient Greeks would regale each other with Homeric tales of Helen of Troy and Odysseus, and I get a shiver up my spine when I think of the first moment that some bright spark of a storyteller realized that the glow from the fire they were all sitting around cast a shadow of their body on the wall behind, making a fantastic cyclops shape, which massively enhanced the power of their tale. In the last few years, we've seen an enormous explosion in the different ways in which live performance is captured and made accessible to us. Both the National Theatre in London and the Met in New York City have had huge success with their simultaneous live broadcasts into cinemas all over the world of productions like Phaedra, starring Helen Mirren, and Madame Butterfly into Times Square there. Although nobody seems to be watching it, but it was there. The Manchester-based company Quarantine have been touring a mobile karaoke cabin in which you can duet with a serving member of the British Army. Even the Royal Shakespeare Company recently experimented with a Twitter-based production of Romeo and Juliet called, wait for it, Such Tweet Sorrow. You see there, that's Juliet Cap, 16. She just got home from school, a day full of boring maths lessons. Boys at school are so minging. These have had and continue to have a profound effect on the way theatre artists and audiences are connecting, and are all incredibly imaginative ways of attempting to increase audiences for our work, but they're not live experiences. I want to talk about theatre as a live experience and as an event. I think there's something in all of us as human beings which craves a sense of event, of sharing the experience of a work of art in the same room as the performers and other audience members. Like much live performance, music gigs, and so on, theatre is a fantastic deliverer of event. It's perfectly placed to offer this, but I wonder if it can only fully exploit this opportunity if it acknowledges and celebrates its liveness. Now, this is the question that I'm going to explore today, but what do I mean by liveness? In the past couple of decades, audiences and artists' definitions of what theatre can be and where it can take place have expanded exponentially. It's something which brings me great pleasure. I often worry as a theatre maker that there's nothing more intimidating or alienating for a first-time theatre goer than walking through an old Victorian edifice, much as I love them, into a chandelier-encrusted foyer, to then go and sit in a quiet, red, velvet-clad auditorium, surrounded by grey heads, much as I love them, and watch a dense and wordy drama which terrifies the life out of you. We need to get better at discussing and developing the language of theatre. And what do I mean by the language of theatre? Well, one of the great Scottish demotic minds of the 20th century, John McGrath, wrote a brilliant book in the late 70s called A Good Night Out, much of which is still shockingly relevant today. And in that book, he contests the notion that the language of theatre refers to its literary elements, as if theatre were only words on a page and could be discussed like a book. Instead, he demands that the language of theatre is seen in the same way as the language of cinema, which includes the lighting, the editing, the locations, the camera angles, and so on. He writes, "I must emphasize that the language of theatre is possibly even more extensive than that normally ascribed to cinema. For not only must the text, mise en scène, lighting, performances, music, effects, placing on the stage, all be taken into account in order to arrive at a description of the stage event, but also the nature of the audience, the nature, social, geographical, and physical, of the venue, the price of tickets, the availability of tickets, the nature and placing of the pre-publicity, where the nearest pub is, very important, and the relationships between all these considerations themselves and of each with what is happening on stage. For when we discuss theatre, we are discussing a social event." These are all questions that we grapple with every day at the company I work for, the National Theatre of Scotland, where I am Associate Director, as you heard, when I'm not swanning around Cambridge. I'd like to introduce you to the work of the company and talk about some of the productions that we've done and that I've directed. 6 years ago, I joined a very small group of people who had been charged with the privileged task of setting up a brand new National Theatre of Scotland. And the brief background to this is as follows. Tony Blair had included in his manifesto for the Labour Party's landslide election victory in '97 a promise to allow Scotland a referendum to have a devolved parliament, which it hadn't had since 1707. The referendum was voted and they said yes, and the new Scottish Parliament, aware that Scotland's identity is defined and explored powerfully through its art, almost immediately decided that they wanted to make a strong cultural statement. Now, Scotland already had a national opera, a national ballet, and 2 national orchestras, so the genesis of a national theatre began. Now, initially, the presumption was that a new state-of-the-art theatre complex would be designed and built at great expense to the Scottish taxpayer to rival, for example, the national theatres on London's South Bank. But whispers were already emerging that maybe this wasn't the most progressive way forward. Then the Scottish Parliament did what politicians rarely do, and they asked people what they thought about their prospective national theatre. And so a period of meaningful consultation began, not just with the arts community in Scotland, but with as diverse a cross-section of society as possible. And the response overwhelmingly came back that the considerable amount of money that had been put aside for the National Theatre of Scotland shouldn't be spent on bricks and mortar, but rather a touring company who would perform their work in the many rarely used or empty theatres all over the country. The small group I referred to earlier were appointed at this stage, and under the frankly brilliant leadership of our artistic director, Vicky Featherstone, we took this aspiration and worked hard to develop a practical vision for the company, more of which in a moment. The 25th of February is in 10 days' time, and on that day the National Theatre of Scotland will celebrate its 5th birthday. Now, 5 years may seem to you to be a very short time in the life of a national company, but for us it's hard to believe that we've been in existence for that long. In that time, we've produced over 135 new pieces of theatre, performed to over 600,000 people in about 180 different venues over 3 continents. Now, here's a sneak preview of a video that we've created to mark our birthday and to celebrate some of the work that we've produced over those 5 years.
What's matter anyway?
Extreme!
Too much? Take them home.
I'm sorry if that seems like an advert for the National Theatre of Scotland, but we've just done that and I'm really proud of it and I wanted to share it with you. So, theatre without walls. It's a term that we came up with early on and which has very happily stuck with us. And it obviously refers to the nomadic nature of the company. Beth described it beautifully. It's travelling artistes. There can be something wonderfully centrifugal about national institutions rooted in capital cities, which suck in people to share in the sampling of their wares. But there's also something wonderfully democratic about a national company which takes its work to the nation. In some senses, it has forced us to be a truly national company. A theatre without walls also encapsulates our philosophy about theatre as an evolving art form. As I said before, there's a growing belief among theatre makers and audiences that theatre can be anything and anywhere. And this has allowed us not just to see all of Scotland's theatre spaces as performance venues, but the whole of Scotland as our stage. From shopping centres to airports to remote islands. Theatre tells great stories, it reflects our lives, it can even touch our hearts. But who's to say what form and in what environment those things should happen? Indeed, there's a strong argument that the unexpected experience of a piece of theatre puts us in a heightened state of awareness, and so our connection can be even more profound. I'll talk more about that later. Back to 2005 and the small group setting up the new National Theatre of Scotland. We decided to announce a full year's programme of work so that we could fully declare the range of our Theatre Without Walls ambitions as fully as possible. But that still left the issue of what our very first production should be. Now, try as we might, we knew that whatever it was, we would be defined by it. And there was a widely held expectation that we would launch ourselves to the world with a classic play, a Chekhov or an Ibsen, for example, in a sumptuous and beautifully costumed production starring one or two famous Scottish actors that we'd managed to lure back from Los Angeles at one of the beautiful old theatres like Edinburgh Festival Theatre, with a big red carpet and the great and the good of Scotland sipping champagne in their finery. So we did the absolute opposite. And on February the 25th, 2006, the National Theatre of Scotland was launched with Home. 10 productions in 10 different locations across Scotland, which all opened more or less at the same time on the same evening. The umbrella title Home gave the 10 events a sense of unity and purpose and was intended to stimulate a moment of reflection for a country celebrating its first ever national theatre. It drove the critics crazy, of course, because they couldn't get to see them all. They had to choose. It was hilarious. And the idea was that we would assign a director to each of the 10 locations, which were chosen based on a geographic formula that meant that anybody in Scotland could get to one of the productions within 2 hours. It took hours to work that out, but we did it. The directors would be resident in each of the locations over a number of weeks and would create a unique theatrical event fueled by their time there and the theme of home, whether that be personal or political or something else altogether. Now, none of the venues were to be traditional theatres in order that we could really put our money where our mouth was about our belief that theatre can be anything and anywhere. And so the locations ranged from a ferry docked in Lerwick Harbour in the Shetland Isles, through a shop front in Stornoway in the Outer Hebrides, to a forest outside Edinburgh. And Vicky, our artistic director, had a fantastic image, I think, of the pieces of theatre being fire beacons lighting up one by one in the same way that good news used to be passed across the country historically. I was assigned to create a piece of work in Easterhouse, a deprived housing scheme in the East End of Glasgow. Now here's a little clip of what we made, and you can tell from just how knackered I look and how inarticulate I am, what a task it was, so no giggling.
We are in an 18-storey tower block, which is where my first kind of sense of this project came from, seeing this tower block, and it's...
Can you hear?
It's from the idea of the two iconic kind of structures, I suppose, in Scotland, which are mountains and tower blocks, and I loved the idea of just merging those two, and so the idea of abseilers coming down tower blocks really appealed to me. We've been inundated with offers to use flats. We were sport for choice in terms of which flats we would use. Everyone just seemed very happy, and they've given us their keys so that we can have access to their flats whenever we like, and it's their homes. So it's a kind of, there's a double layer thing going on there. We're kind of completely invading their homes to tell a story about people's homes being invaded.
MI5 surveillance. Operation Spider-Man. 25 subterfuges intercepted email correspondence between Murdo Ferguson, username Danger Mouse, and Thomas Ferguson, username Chemical Tan. related to highly sensitive information about depleted uranium.
Sutra Place, the tower block we worked in, was overlooked by a natural grass amphitheatre which could hold an audience of up to 1,000 people per performance, which was perfect for me as I hated the idea of turning anyone away, especially like all the homes, it was free, our way of saying hello to Scotland. The abseilers had video cameras attached to their helmets, and as they arrived at certain windows, they would film what was going on inside that apartment, and this was projected live, as you saw, onto the side of a large truck at the bottom of the tower block. The different scenes adding up to tell a story. The projections aside, it was clear to the audience that it was totally live, as they witnessed some of the characters arriving at Sutra Place, doing handbrake turns in cars, hanging out of windows, shouting to people below. It worked, but it was crazy, especially for the poor actors running up and down the stairs to get to each of the designated apartments because we daren't use the elevators in case this got stuck. And there was one particularly crazy moment when the person whose kitchen we were using for one of the later scenes, she'd forgotten about us and gone out. She hadn't given us her keys. And so the very famous, in Glasgow, actress who was in that scene had to run along the whole of that floor, knocking on people's doors and saying, please, can I borrow your kitchen for a play? And she got one. So how does this context change the experience for the audience and their relationship to the story? How is it different to watching a play in a theatre set in an apartment? Well, to start with, the spectacle of seeing an 18-story tower block lit with bright pink lights and with abseilers scooting down is really exhilarating. It gets your attention. It makes you want to see what's going to happen. And the fact that we're using people's real homes makes you think differently about the story. Yes, it's fiction, but what's going on behind the other windows? And it's unexpected. It takes a place that you might be familiar with and transforms it. And I think it makes you look at the world slightly differently. And I'll talk more about this during my next example, but that was home. At the National Theatre of Scotland, we don't divide our work with schools and community groups and the socially excluded from what is kind of known as our professional or main programme, either in terms of the ambition of the work or the personnel involved. Transform is the name for a vital strand of work which embeds a group of artists, very like home, in a community over a period of months to create a piece of theatre with that community. And in 2009, I had the privilege of going to live for a time in Thurso in Caithness, which is as far north as you can go on the Scottish mainland without falling into the sea. That's me falling into the sea. Thurso has a relatively large population in spite of its isolation due to the fact that it's next to Dounreay, a nuclear power station that has now closed down, leaving widespread unemployment. I took my closest collaborators with me, and because it's an arduous 8-hour journey from Glasgow, we were there for the duration. We were based mainly in the high school, working with over 100 14 and 15-year-olds, although the show we created actually featured almost twice that number once other groups and members of the community got involved. The school, like many in Scotland, had no drama department, so we had to work in a very specific way to give the kids any sense of ownership over the project. So we started by asking them what they liked, and I remember one boy answered immediately, shooting rabbits and outdoor sex. So we rephrased our question, what do you like in terms of stories? And what would you like this production to be like? And the unanimous reply was, not boring. And this brought to mind an article written in the Guardian newspaper by a fantastic Scottish playwright and director, Anthony Neilson. And I think it's one of the most significant pieces of writing about theatre I've ever read. I thought I'd write 10 commandments, this is him writing. I thought I'd write 10 commandments for young writers, But A, that's a little pompous, and B, there's only one commandment worth a damn, and it's this: thou shalt not bore. Boring an audience is the one true sin in theatre. We've been boring audiences for decades now, and they've responded by slowly withdrawing their patronage. I don't care that the recent production of The Seagull at the Royal Court was sold out. To 95% of the population, the theatre, musicals aside for now, is an irrelevance. Of that 95%, we have managed to lure in maybe 10% at some point in their lives, and we've so swiftly and thoroughly bored them that they've never returned. They're not the ones who broke the contract. They paid their money and expected entertainment. We sent them back into the night feeling bored, bullied, and baffled. So what are we doing wrong? The most depressing response I encounter when I'm chatting someone up and I ask them if they ever go to the theatre is this: I should go, but I don't. That emphatic should tells you all you need to know. Imagine it in other contexts. I should play Grand Theft Auto. I should watch Strictly Come Dancing, which is our version of Dancing with the Stars, without Bristol Palin. So it seems obvious that people see theatre going not as entertainment, but as self-improvement. And the critical academic establishment have to take some blame for that. Right then, I thought, best not be boring. This thinking coincided with the search for a suitable venue in the theatreless town. We couldn't find a space big enough to fit all the performers without even counting the sizable audience that were coming. So we decided that the least boring option was to turn the whole town into a stage. The kids also said that they wanted the audience to feel as involved as possible, like they do when they're singing along at a music gig. So, after a period of experimentation, as I was saying, in development, we came up with the idea of Hunter, which was basically this. The audience were invited to congregate in the town church, and upon arriving, were divided into small groups. They then discovered they were at a town meeting and asked for help searching for a teenager who had gone missing. Each group was sent to a specific location where they experienced a performance of some kind, within which were clues to both the story behind the disappearance and the next location that they should travel to. It was a kind of treasure hunt where the narrative was the treasure. And incidentally, it was a happy ending. The disappearance had actually turned out to be an escape. Now, we had a week of performances in the town throughout beautiful summer weather. It doesn't really get dark in Scotland, at the north of Scotland at that time of year. And I can hand on heart say that of all the projects I've been involved in creating, it has made me the proudest. There were the classic turnarounds of impossibly sulky adolescents who completely transformed through the project and now want to be actors and musicians. But it was the audience's connection with the experience, guessing the clues, the next location and so on, and how active, alert, and absorbed they were that made my heart burst. Because we had performances all over the town, mainly indoors, but also some interventions and happenings outdoors as the group walked around. For example, Donnie Darko rabbit-dressed kids on trampolines. Some audience members commented that they weren't sure what had been created by us and what hadn't. On one of the evenings, there was a fisherman standing in the river that runs through the middle of Thurso for hours, and everyone thought he was a clue. On another evening, there was a hen night, a bachelorette party parading through the town, and I thanked my lucky stars for that. As I said before, I love the idea of creating an experience that makes people feel differently about their environment. I'm a huge fan of the British artist Andy Goldsworthy, who produces site-specific sculptures and land art mainly situated in natural settings. And sometimes with his work, in a forest, for example, you're not sure if it's him or nature that has produced the stunningly beautiful twists of branches in front of you. And it makes you look at the whole forest differently. You become more alert. That's what we were trying to do in Thurso, and it made the performance feel not just live, but alive. The last piece of theatre I want to talk about is one that I directed in our first year back in 2006, but is still touring, and in fact, it opens tomorrow night at the University of Texas in Austin. And this is Blackwatch. Blackwatch is based on interviews with young soldiers, as you heard before, from the legendary Scottish military regiment, the Blackwatch, who had just returned from a very controversial deployment in Iraq when we interviewed them. It tries to communicate the experience of what it's like to be a soldier in Iraq or Afghanistan. And whilst every theatre director wants their work to have longevity, I sometimes find it very difficult to celebrate that Blackwatch is still as relevant as it is. The physical production of Blackwatch was conceived late in 2005 after I attended the military tattoo that takes place every year during the Edinburgh Festival in the castle. The tattoo is a spectacle where the audience sit in stadium seating either side of an esplanade and are bombarded by military music, lighting, movement, and a kind of vanity I found uncomfortable and only latterly came to understand. I wanted to create a mini tattoo for our audience, but use it to transport them to Iraq theatrically. We found a drill hall in Edinburgh, close to the castle, that was being used as a car park by the university, and we were off. And here are some moments from the current production of Blackwatch.
This may be the last attack for 1st Battalion Blackwatch. Let us make sure it's as good as anything we've done in the past, and it's one that we can be proud of. Forward the 42nd!
You're in a war, eh? Except you're not really doing the job you were trained for.
The Black Watch have been sent to do an impossible job.
Here we are, again.
I hope we do better.
I thought you said you were interested in us. Aye, this was about our story.
I fought for my regiment.
I fought for my mates.
Not long into that 3-week run at the 2006 Edinburgh Festival Fringe, we realised that there was an appetite for Blackwatch to tour, but obviously it was site-specific. Due to the tattoo staging and size of floor space needed, conventional theatres were not an option, so we started the long and arduous task of searching for possible spaces for the production, and as a result of the hard work of everyone at the National Theatre of Scotland, we've now been able to take Blackwatch to audiences all over the world, performing in venues as diverse as a disused hydroelectric laboratory in Pitlochry in Scotland, a warehouse underneath Brooklyn Bridge in New York, a converted train factory in Sydney, even an ice rink in Toronto. But how does this staging make the experience of Blackwatch different? Well, here's a time-lapse video of the 3-day construction that creates both the seating and the stage for Blackwatch. This was filmed in an exhibition centre we played in Glasgow, which is normally used for rock concerts. The physical relationship between the audience and the actors has been crucial, I think, to the success of the show. Initially at the Drill Hall in Edinburgh, there was a real awareness that this was like the tattoo, and they were watching a show in a building that had seen countless generations of young Scottish soldiers being drilled before sent off to war. But even when we took the show outside the Drill Hall and outside Scotland, where you couldn't rely on those references, the audiences have still shown a remarkable interaction. They're entering an unusual space or a familiar space that looks totally different, so their senses are heightened. They can see the other half of the audience, so they're clearly aware of themselves and each other throughout the show. The lights, the explosions, the music is coming from all around them, behind them, even from under them. They're embedded. I hope they will have given you a sense of our ambitions at the National Theatre of Scotland as we enter our 5th year. We're aware that evolution is a continuous process, and it would be very easy for us to stop developing. So we try to challenge and frighten ourselves, always with an eye to stimulating the artists we work with and exciting our audiences, always with an eye to the future. But what is the future for theatre? Well, I love the idea that in years to come, no space will be safe from theatre, and that it truly is anywhere. I also love the idea that theatre will come to encompass a much fuller range of performance possibilities. I don't think it'll surprise anyone from what I've said or the work that you've seen so far, that I think it's time that the definitions constraining single art forms were dissolved. Between visual art, music, dance, and so on. Dissolve them. I want to quote here from Philip Byther, the Senior Curator for Performing Arts at the Walker Arts Centre in Minneapolis. And to me, it's striking when I think back to what John McGrath wrote in the 1970s. Philip says, complex media forms, new sonic and sensory designs, extended vocal techniques, new visual and ritual forms, simplicity and minimalism, physicality and high design will all push theatre forward. What's viewed as experimental today will become commonplace. In the future, content delivery will not just travel on a one-way street, from the playwrights, directors, and performers to the passive ticket holder sitting still in the dark. A greater embrace of interactivity, participation, and personal lineal connections with artists before, sometimes during, and after performances will become the standard. The social and presentational will deeply and regularly intersect. Theatre will play an essential part of our culture, but only if it continues to take chances, push out at the edges, rethink its relationship to time and space. What we think currently of unusual theatre venues, social settings, clubs, bars, living rooms, site-specific locations, galleries, parks, community centres will become the new normal, while traditional proscenium venues will become more the selective shrine, the museum. The ensemble and the collective will assert an even greater spirit. Old hierarchies will break down both internally and externally. As interdisciplinary approaches become more standard and artists with distinctly different training and backgrounds collaborate, content will also expand. Youth and pop cultures, as well as global influences and diverse cultural perspectives, will blossom forth. Yes, theatre will confront severe crises of confidence in coming decades, but these pressures will force collaborative conversations, new formal approaches, and more immediate social and political directions, which will allow theatre to become more relevant and welcoming, important and surprising, provocative and fun, fast enough on its feet for breakneck nations in the digital age. Hear, hear. My time at the Radcliffe Institute has focused specifically on an area that again brings us back to the prophet John McGrath's assertion about what we define as the language of theatre. Like much of what I've talked about this afternoon, I'm interested in exploring what we can discover out with formal theatrical structures. And so my research has found its home in what's called paralanguage. Now, paralanguage refers to everything that comes out of our mouths when we communicate, apart from the words. Outside of rehearsal rooms, it's rarely discussed in the world of theatre, perhaps because it's so closely associated with language, meaning words on a page. Now, it may not feel as immediately extreme as site-specific theatre in tower blocks or turning a whole town into a venue, but to me, it's just as radical and as powerful a tool in terms of the evolution of theatre. Paralanguage may be expressed consciously or unconsciously, and it includes the pitch, volume, and intonation of speech. And for me, more even than the words that we choose, the way we speak can be a complex attempt to control the way the world interprets us. The fact that it can be expressed unconsciously is also fascinating to me as a theatre director, as characters who are communicating things to an audience when they're apparently unaware that they're communicating them are gold dust. For centuries, theatre makers have put a great deal of their energy into creating witty and weighty lines for actors to speak. And we've constructed, shaped, refined, and polished the dialogue of theatre to within an inch of its life. Paralanguage contributes massively to our sense of identity, and the study of paralanguage asks the question, who am I? This has been a question that drama has asked since the ancient Greeks and Oedipus the king, who won't rest until he discovers his identity, even when he knows it's going to destroy him. It's also a question that so many of my brilliant colleagues at the Radcliffe Institute this year are asking in their way, whether it be through the manipulation of DNA, what invasions of privacy we will tolerate in terms of cybersecurity, uncovering the neural mechanisms that underlie colour perception, or the sonic feminism of Aretha Franklin. Who are we? It's a fundamental question, and one that feeds my ever-increasing passion for theatre and all its astonishing languages. And it gives me an answer to my question, can we keep up? And I'd like to answer on behalf of all my theatre colleagues in the audience when I say, abso-bloody-lutely. But can you keep up with us? Thank you. Can we change the lights, Justin, oh, you've done it. Way ahead. 2 glamorous assistants. Questions?
This isn't so much a question as a comment. I study early 20th century China, and when I listened to you speaking, it just so reminded me of all those young communists in Yan'an in the 1930s. And they did all these things, and they created theatre that was in the round. They created spoken drama, which was completely new to China in those days. And they were really good at it. And they were in some back beyond rural area, and people were really excited by this stuff. But you go back to these places now, and what do people want? What they want and what they have is what they put on locally, and it's traditional Chinese opera with heavy amplification and canto pop singing styles added. And it's done in the temple fairs, in the big shopping festivals, and it's very much those traditional styles. And the people were really on for all this stuff when the quality was really good, and it succeeded because the quality was good. But whether it was what people really wanted, I don't know, because in the end, what they've gone back to, all that spoken drama, no one's interested in it. It happens in Beijing. There were some classy theatres in Beijing and Shanghai, but you go to Yan'an, and we're right back to something much more like musical drama.
Well, I mean, what I would say to that is I'm flattered by the comparison, Henrietta. What I would say to that is 5% of the population in Britain and America consider themselves theatre goers. So we've got 95% of people to recruit before it goes back. So it's quite a big task ahead of us yet.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I just have a short question. I'm wondering if you can say a little bit more about the process of working with the actors and what it's like for them to be working in a theater with no walls.
They love it. I mean, we do work in theatres as well, but the actors, sometimes they have an initial fear of an audience member being there. And literally, you can see the fear in their eyes as well as in your eyes. But the actors we tend to work with are kind of actors that are absolutely part of this philosophy. So they also want to increase audiences for theatre, to increase the relevance for theatre, to make better theatre. So we tend to work with the same actors over a period of time. We don't have an ensemble of actors, a company, but we tend to come back to those actors who are up for it, really. But, and we're very, very honest about the work that we create. I now have what I call the prenup before I offer an actor a job, because the work that I do tends to be very physical. It involves a lot of movement, a lot of it's dangerous. It can be dangerous. A lot of singing, and so I say to them, look, it's hard work. You're going to have to do an hour of yoga before every performance. I demand that, and I will give you physiotherapists and things like that. But you've got to make sure you don't go out and get drunk at night. So it's what I call the prenup, and I say, if you're not really up for that, then don't come, don't do it. So, but most of them are up for it. Hi.
Thanks so much. I perceived maybe a tiny bit of tension between the way you talk about liveness in terms of really face-to-face, body-to-body experience, and then the way I could see some aspects of digital media creeping into some of the work. So I'm curious about, the liveness of a TV camera looking into a tower block projecting onto a truck versus the liveness of the Romeo and Juliet Twitter feed. I mean, why is the Romeo and Juliet Twitter play not live? You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, great question. Because what the audience do, what happens in that moment of communion between the performers and the audience, with a Twitter-based play, can't change that play in the moment. When you've got a live experience, even when it's something which is being filmed and projected, the actors can hear the audience. So it becomes literally a dialogue. And the way that audience is reacting and responding makes that moment unique. Whereas if it's something which is pre-recorded or done, within an office somewhere on Twitter, the audience can't change. Does that make sense?
They could, though. I mean, that's one of the points about Twitter, right?
Not in the moment.
Uh-huh.
Not in the moment. Not because there's something about a live performance. It communicates not just what it's communicating, but an energy. So we've all got an energy in this room now because of the fact that you can not just hear what I'm saying, but the molecules that are coming out of my mouth are hitting you. There's something, and I know that sounds a bit spiritual and wanky. I don't care. I do think that and I can feel the energy coming from you, and you don't get that on Twitter.
Yeah, let's talk more. Thanks.
I have a question about your unconventional use of space. Which usually comes first, the project or the space that you decide to use? Do you ever find a space and think, wow, I don't have a particular project in mind for this, but I definitely want to do something here? Can it sort of ever go the other way around, where the space comes before the project?
There's no real formula for which comes first. I mean, one of the dangers with site-specific theatre, and I was talking to some students about this over lunch today, is that it can become gimmicky. And So if you go, I want to do a piece of theatre in a car, you know, it's kind of, that's all great, but what are you going to do in there? So it's quite, you have to try and, you have to start by asking the question, I'd like to do this to an audience. And then you might find what the story is and where that should take place. So it's about what you want to excite in an audience, I think. I want to communicate this to an audience. I want to have this relationship with an audience. Let's find the best place to do that and the best story to tell it. Oh no.
I'm going to ask one of those questions, John. Wonderful talk, and just one, but much more wonderful theater. Just fabulous.
I know, I'm sorry it's recorded. That's the terrible irony, isn't it, about the fact.
I wanted to fly down to Austin tonight is what I wanted to do. So I have a question that comes out sounding like a scientist, but that's not at all what I wanted to sound like. And it's, how do you measure success? And what I'm really thinking about here is that 95% who doesn't go to the theater, who thinks of Shakespeare as something that you read in fifth form, and so on, and who doesn't go after they have to go to school classes. So are you seeing, from what you're doing, more people going to things that you're not producing, but that, are you seeing more Shakespeare? How would you measure success? And I'm not expecting in 5 years of the National Theatre, in the little towns in Pitlochry and so on, to see that, but how would you see, what would you call success 10, 15, 20 years from now?
That more people go to the theatre, but don't just go, they have an active relationship with it.
So what does that mean?
That means that they want theatre which they have an interactive relationship with, that challenges them, but also they can challenge it. It's any success I measure on stopping, as I described, that one-way street between a theatre maker and a passive ticket holder. And theatre which celebrates the fact that it's live, I think does that, which is, it's really clear to me that that's why I found a home in Scotland, because Scotland's theatre traditions are very aware of itself as theatre, as live. There's a lot of narration, there's a lot of visual art in it, there's a lot of direct address to the audience. It's much closely connected to vaudeville and music hall than it is kind of literary theatre as such. And I think if there's more of that kind of theatre and more audiences having a profound relationship with theatre where it's not just, they're not seeing it as self-improvement. I should go to the theatre more. That's it. Actually, it's a really simple answer. People stop saying, I should go to the theatre, and they say, I have to go to the theatre. That's it.
Very good. Thank you.
That was amazing, and seeing Black Watch again makes me cry. Oh, sorry. That was amazing.
Come on, Lynn.
Brilliant. And I cry every time I see even sections of Black Watch. Thank you. I just actually want to continue a conversation that we had earlier in the street, which was that everyone grows up wanting to be an actor or an actress, and every child who hasn't got autism, and it's a diagnostic sign, wants to pretend and be someone else. So the tragedy, this is half comment, half question, is what happens? That we lose that as we get older. And it seems to me you are doing something, and I loved what you're doing in the north of Scotland, that has the potential not just to bring theatre to people, but to turn large numbers of us back into performers that recreate theatre as we used to do when we didn't have other kinds of entertainment. And I'm wondering, I love the fact that National Theatre seems to be getting away with those old divisions between street theatre and community theatre that we all used to do, 784 and Red Ladder, blah, 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 and serious theatre done by professionals. And I'd like to hear more about what you're doing there with that, and how you see, whether you agree with me that the democratization of the theatre includes letting everybody act as well as see, and how you're fostering that a bit more apart from what you did in First.
Thank you. I mean, you've touched on what I think is one of the great truths about theatre, and why I'm a theatre director, really, and why, I mean, it saved my life, being involved in the theatre, definitely. I think great theatre turns us into children, because it taps in to that imaginative that playful place. And it's really sad that that place has to be reawakened, but it does. One of my favorite ever stories is Peter Pan, because of what it does to not just children, but to adults as well. And it's so sad, I think, when Peter goes back and Wendy's grown up. I find it heartbreaking. And so I think your insights are absolutely true. And I don't know, it's a shame that people look at theatre so seriously, I think, because I think that's what contributes to this sense of it being self-improving in some way, that it's some kind of church that people go to in order to become kind of more fully rounded human beings. And when actually, the best theatre makes us retreat into when we were, when we didn't have those inhibitions that we grow up with. And it also taps into a project, a piece of research that I found while I've been here from a professor of neuroscience back at UCL in London, who I know I've spoken to some of you about this, but she's been doing work MRI scanning actors. In fact, Fiona Shaw, the actress, she MRI scanned her when she was performing part of The Wasteland, T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. And the presumption of being that it would use the same areas of the brain that recall did. And now, obviously, that wasn't the case. It actually tapped into the areas of the brain that we use for imagination, that the developing children, that's what she was using. And it was so obvious to me that that was the case. So thank you. Great comments, Lynn.
Thank you. That was wonderful. I have a question about a political question. So the original subvention came from the Scottish government, right? To what extent is your support, your continued financial support coming from the state? And to what extent do you find does that in any way impinge upon your artistic freedom?
Well, we have very different to the way it works in England. The national companies in Scotland are funded directly by the government, and it's a good whack of money. They have put their money where their mouth is, and in fact, the Scottish government have protected us from the recent horrible cuts that have gone on in England. Now, it's quite interesting because we were very concerned when that was the case, just in terms of that direct relationship. What would they be wanting? Would it, the SNP are now in power. Alex Salmond, the Scottish National Party, he's the First Minister of Scotland. And would that mean that if we ever did a piece of theatre that criticised the Scottish National Party? But actually, what they did as soon as they got into power was they created a bill that enshrined our independence, all the national companies' independence, which has been amazing, I think. We haven't yet done a piece of theatre that absolutely slams it to them in the way that I suppose Blackwatch slightly slammed it to the Labour government. So it'd be quite interesting to see if they'll still come along to our first nights and tell us how wonderful we are when we do, but it's coming soon.
Thank you for a very stimulating and moving and inspiring talk. And I'm wondering if you have anything to say that could inform or help people in other fields who want to bring the kind of flexibility of mind and imagination and creativity that you've brought to the theater to other areas of work, whether it be artistic or scholarly or activism. Your work is so inspiring.
Thank you. Come to the Radcliffe. I mean, I've been inspired by you, seriously, and I'm not just saying that. I think what you're all doing, and so it was wonderful to reference some of the other research projects that are going on, because what you're doing is absolutely inspiring me. Everybody needs some time out from what they do to think not just about their research project, which has been brilliant for me, but actually to listen to other people. So I don't know that I could bring any more creativity to what you amazing people are doing and have done for me. It's true.
So I think we should all go down to, is it Austin, Texas?
They'll be doing that thing at the moment. They'll be halfway through that time lapse.
2 quick questions. One, could you talk a little bit about how your work draws on the tradition of happenings of the 1960s, and how much of that is alive in what you do, how much you're doing differently? And then the other question was about paralanguage and language. For me, and of course it's part of my professional deformation, being in the theater is being seduced by language. And I wonder how pleasure is elicited linguistically in the work you do, or if you decide that the theatrical event and experience can do without that.
Okay, thank you. Great questions. I've never experienced a happening in the 60s because I wasn't there, but I absolutely am inspired by them in terms of the experience that the audience had of them, and that absolutely fed into John McGrath and his philosophies, who is absolutely one of my heroes, as I'm sure you probably gathered. What the happenings did, I think, was fuel this idea that, because they used popular forms in many ways, and they fueled the 60s with people like Joan Littlewood and Oh What a Lovely War and that kind of work, and then on to John McGrath with his work with 784. That was a theatre company he ran, by the way, which was based on the fact that 7% of people in Scotland own 84% of the wealth, and it's actually got worse now. And so I'm inspired by their work, which was in turn inspired by the happenings, and as I say, it's popular forms like music hall and variety that I think are inherently democratic and demotic. In terms of the paralanguage question, I'm loving the fact that, because I've spent 5 years thinking about theatre as spectacle on a big scale and the environment, and actually what I'm really, really loving, because language for me brings me great pleasure. Samuel Beckett, you know, in a way, I don't know if we've moved on from that yet in terms of how radical he was in terms of language. And, you know, people in his mould like Carol Churchill, you know, I'm never happier than when sat listening to their words. But what I'm interested in is obviously that theatre continuing and us all going and loving it as much as possible, but also other kinds of, well, the paralanguage coming in as well, so that we explore that, because I don't think it's been explored enough. And I think, as I said, that there's a lyricism in everything apart from the words that can be as beautiful as what Samuel Beckett wrote.
Please join me in thanking John and join us downstairs for the reception.